There we go. All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming in today on a day where we celebrate the memory of the great prophet, the great orator, the great Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to be together today, me and Conrad, talking about Conrad has firsthand experience with MLK. I'll be talking about the legacy that I learned growing up in the 90s and 2000s and how we reconcile that with who we know MLK to be, independent of who we were taught he was. Conrad, I'm going to let you introduce the conversation and start us
Thank you. I'm assuming that everybody can still hear me. I was a pre-adolescent, actually. I was about 10 years old when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. And what I've observed over the years is that those of us who were alive during the time of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s work,
Sorry, y'all.
many of us have a different perspective on who he was, and we have a different perspective on the legacy. And so that's kind of one of the things that we want to talk most about today. What is Dr. King's legacy? I mean, his true legacy, not what some of us have been led to believe is Dr. King's legacy. For instance, can I go on?
Please do.
For instance, I think that what I observe is that Dr. King has been what I call Santa Claused. In that, Santa Claus, we understand that he's this mythical character. He's a good person who could literally not like Santa Claus.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all this mythology built around Santa Claus. And because we have allowed the legacy of Dr. King to be turned over to our education system, our children and little white kids also suffer because the way our education system approaches history, and I use that word deliberately rather than saying teach history. The way our education system approaches history is to feed our children a compilation of romantic stories from one specific perspective, from one side, a compilation of romantic stories that don't capture that just don't capture the reality of the events from other perspectives. So I think that relinquishing Dr. King's legacy to our education system means that our children are getting a compilation of romantic stories that don't reflect what Dr. King's work truly was. When he was assassinated, his popularity was literally at 10% in the United States. So, I mean, that's lower than Donald Trump's. I mean, the current president's approval rating is at 39, which is low. I don't think that there's ever been a president, since they've been doing these polls, I don't think there's ever been a president who's had an approval rating that far below 50. So what has to happen in the nation for a public figure to have an approval rating of 10% of the entire nation? That means people don't like you. that literally means people do not like you. So the question then becomes, for us who are living in this generation where we are having Dr. King Day, we're celebrating his day. The question becomes, why was he not liked by so much of the nation? Why was he not liked? What was it that he was doing that made him so disliked? And whatever those things were, it seems like it would be more true to his legacy if we were doing those things to commemorate his birthday. That's a lot. I was just talking for a long time, wasn't I?
And I keep on trying to share this video to my timeline, and I'm having a bunch of trouble. So my looking down was not because I wasn't paying attention. I was trying to figure out how to share this on my personal Facebook timeline. Those of you, I know that we have like a little bit less than 10 people watching. Those of you that are watching, please be sure to share this video on your timeline as well. I guess I'll go into a little bit of my experience learning about Martin Luther King Jr. growing up. I was homeschooled by a, as I say, boomer Black woman. So I learned kind of firsthand history of Martin Luther King Jr. And I had the experience of knowing how my mom experienced Martin Luther King Jr. personally, and the memory of his death. My mom oftentimes talks about how her mother never allowed them, even if they were sick, never allowed them to stay home from school. But she has this distinct memory of her older sisters being allowed to stay home from school for Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral. So I have this, the foundation of my learning about Martin Luther King Jr. is coming from a Black woman who experienced his speeches and experienced his work firsthand. However, when I went to school, I started kind of getting that Santa Clausy, fluffy Martin Luther King Jr. that Conrad was just talking about. And the way Martin Luther King was Santa Claus actually made him kind of repugnant to me. I can remember going through a period in which I was, I like the phrase like, oh, I'm more like Malcolm than I am Martin. Or, I can remember fussing at one of my high school teachers that I didn't want to hear about Martin Luther King anymore. Like I wanted to hear about other, historical figures. And I think that's absolutely because the parts of Martin Luther King that many of his contemporaries at the time that he was alive, the things that they hated about him have, for whatever reason, totally been dissolved. And Martin Luther King's memory has been made to be palatable to white people as opposed to truth bringing to Black folks. And I think it's interesting, Conrad, that you pointed that out immediately. And I'm wondering, did you notice when that shift began to happen? A lot of people, once they die, their memory becomes kind of fluffy, right? Like everybody loves to just remember all the good things about that person once they die. So I'm sure that was a starting point of when his memory started to be Santa Claus. But yeah, the experience that I've had in the 90s with Martin Luther King, I think it's probably totally different from what you saw in the 60s and 70s. And I'm wondering if you've seen that slow shift.
Yeah, I think remember former, now deceased Senator John McCain, who turned out to be the arch nemesis of the current soon to be former president, number 45. Senator John McCain was one of the senators who was very vocal about not allowing Martin Luther King's birthday to become a national holiday.
Oh, wow.
Right. So that made me think a certain way about John McCain at the time. Chris Rock had a very funny joke about that also, where he was, Chris Rock can be very raw with his humor. And he basically was saying, basically the country's not asking you to do anything but take a day off with pay. I mean, Jesus,
Right.
Who wouldn't want that?
Could you want?
Yeah. The country's just saying, hey, let's take a day off with pay. But anyway, when the push to to make Dr. King's birthday a national holiday, in my opinion, that's when the Santa Clausing began.
They needed to make it make sense.
Yeah, they needed to make him, again, as I said, he was doing things that made him unlikable
What are
to
some of those things? Because I feel like lots of white folks, sorry, white people, you should still donate to us.
yeah,
But lots of white folks really only like to remember all the deliciousness, which is like
yes,
unity. And
yeah,
I have a
yeah,
dream where all my Black kids and the white kids
right.
are together. So, what are the things that are a little bit less talked about that you're thinking of?
Well, one of the things that is very often just dismissed as though it didn't happen. He was against the he was against the Vietnam War,
Mm-hmm.
and so uh, while many, and this is even clergy, Christians were not, he didn't have a high favorability rate among Christians, and surprisingly, there were a lot of people of color clergy who had issues with Dr. King as well, because I think, now this is my interpretation. So this is my perspective. So these opinions are not the opinions of Roots of Justice. They are the opinions of Conrad L. Moore. Um, but I think I think that people of color socialized in the United States have manifestations of internalized oppression. And one of those manifestations is protecting white people from difficult subjects. Now, some people of color feel a self-serving need to protect white people because you don't want to make white people upset,
Right.
because when you make white people upset, it turns out bad for the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
So so what a lot of what Dr. King was doing was upsetting the white people, and
Mm-hmm.
and 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 so a lot of people of color, when white people start really getting upset, a lot of people of color become afraid of what's going to happen next. And listen, it's not an unreasonable fear. In a lot of cases, it's not an unreasonable fear, because we look at the church bombings and the lynchings, and what happened in places like Greenwood district of Tulsa and
Mm-hmm.
Rosewood, and you know, so all of that is part of our history of what happens and what can happen to very law-abiding people of color when white people get upset.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people of color, a lot of clergy, and even a lot of other white people were fearful of that his work was going to make too many white people upset.
Mm-hmm.
So his stance against the war, against the Vietnam War, and against all war, because he was a man of peace. So his stance against war was 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 problematic. And here's the part that makes it even crazier. The war was already unpopular.
Mm-hmm.
It was already a nationally unpopular war.
Mm-hmm.
So so him standing against it really shouldn't have been that much of a problem. But it was a it was a sense of, this Negro don't know his place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you for civil rights, then stick with that. Don't stick your nose in. Don't stick your nose in. Don't stick your nose in white people's business. Whether we do war or not, that's white folks' business.
Mm-hmm.
You are supposed to be fighting to get black people to be able to sit at the lunch counter and stick to that. And he didn't stick to that. So he was against the war, and uh, the other thing was he was a proponent of economic justice. So he was planning a poor people's march and a poor people's campaign, where he had the potential. I think he had the potential to unite the 99, because the one percenters, that's a part of our vocabulary that's just entered the lexicon for our conversations within the past 10 years or so. I don't remember people talking about the one percenters much earlier than that. But Dr. King was helping the 99 recognize that we have more in common than what separates us. And they recognized, I think, that he had the potential to make more trouble. So,
Hmm.
so he basically was, people were afraid of him.
Hmm.
So people like you and I thought that white people was only scared of Malcolm X. But Dr. King's approval rating proves that that's just mythology. That's just not
Hmm.
true. White people didn't like him either.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I saw a recent cartoon, political cartoon, that was, I guess, used in newspapers in the 1960s, and it had a bunch of people cartoonishly bloodied and laying out on the ground. And then it was MLK at the front, and it was like a thought bubble coming from him, or rather, like a speaking bubble coming from him saying, but I'm here for nonviolence, or, I like a nonviolent protest. And it was making fun of his efforts and calling him violent. And I think that's something that we see even today, is that any effort to change the course of America, to use language that Martin Luther King used, any effort to do that is always looked at as too violent, as too tumultuous, and that we need to move the course of American history and the course of American life in an easier and more peaceful way. But I think that what so many white Americans forget is that change is never peaceful, right?
Right.
When I just start running for the first time after I take 3 weeks off because of Christmas and holidays and stuff from working out, when I get back on the treadmill, that is not peaceful for me. Not peaceful at all, right?
Yeah, I get that.
Having a baby is one of the most exciting things that can happen in a person's life if it was planned and they're ready for it, right? But when that baby arrives, that is a very tumultuous life shift.
Right.
It's not
Right.
peaceful. So
Right.
even if the results are beautiful, uh, any sort of shifting in life is not easy or peaceful or comfortable.
Right.
And so oftentimes white people are asking us to be easier, but they just don't want the movement. They don't want to give things up. They don't want to give their whiteness up, which I have been calling a sickness lately. Whiteness is a sickness. It makes people unwell, and it makes them act upon other people in unwell ways, right? And because whiteness is the only normalcy that they know, it feels scary and it feels non-peaceful. It feels violent, for those things to begin to change. Um, so yeah, it's just funny how that was said about MLK back in the 1960s, and the very same things are being said about BLM protests now and the uprisings against George Floyd. Um,
But
yeah,
even back then, the the actual physical violence, because the movement has always been violent, but but those protesting the injustice, the violence not coming from us.
no,
So so that's the part that's been distorted way too much. The other thing about violence, and I'm glad you brought that up. The other thing about violence is,
because we are non-violent people, you and I, Conrad.
well, absolutely, but I got
I'm laughing because I'm still working through it though.
yeah, yeah, so am I. Because look, I was a
We
gang
both
member.
from Philly.
Exactly, I'm from Philadelphia. I was a gang member back in the day when I was a kid. I was I'm a former Marine. That I did that whole thing. So I am, I am, I am nonviolent by choice, not by chance. Um, but one of the things that we say way too often that that sets my hair on fire, and because we don't think critically about these things when they're being said,
Mm,
but it's annoying when they say violence never solved anything, and and what we have to do is we got to think clearly about the words that we're saying,
Yeah.
because the very country that we live in right now came about through violence.
Mm-hmm.
Period. It wasn't. They did not. The Boston Tea Party and the and the Boston Massacre. Um, they 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 were not peaceful demonstrations. You see, if, if we want to promote this idea that violence never solved anything, then we have to pretend that the Boston Tea Party was a peaceful demonstration, right? It was just a peaceful demonstration in Boston. King George said, "Wow, you know what? They have a good point. Let's give them their freedom."
Mm-hmm.
Well, that didn't happen. That
At all.
clearly didn't happen. So, so while we celebrate the Revolutionary War and then turn to our black children and say, "Listen, violence never solved anything," that's clearly a lie.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we shape this conversation? Well, I'm not. Let's be clear about this. I am not promoting violence as a means of social change. I'm not promoting that at all. What I'm promoting that we stop lying to our children
Right.
and stop romanticizing these stories where there are clear contradictions, where once our children begin thinking critically like you did, many of those people who should be our ancestors and heroes can turn out to be repugnant to us, which was the word you used about how you were beginning to feel about Dr. King,
Mm-hmm.
because because your intellect was resisting the Santa Clausing.
Mm-hmm. And it felt so strategic, right? Like I can remember, and I loved my high school history teacher. Um, he really imparted in me my love for history and like really kind of gave me some of my roots of radicalism. So I'm forever grateful for him. But I distinctly remember the way he constructed Marcus Garvey for me in my AP history class. He kind of presented him like a nutcase, right? Um, and then when I went to college, I really became like awakened to the brilliance that was Marcus Garvey. And I think I say that to say I wanted more stories about Marcus Garvey, and I wanted him to be presented to me um, in a more tangible way, as opposed to kind of just this quack that
Yeah,
wasn't anything like Martin Luther King. Like Martin Luther King is always held to this super high esteem. He's put on this pedestal, and then all the other Black activists are kind of either quacks or they didn't
right,
get it
right,
together or they were
right,
violent. You know what I mean? Like
right.
Marcus Garvey was a quack. Malcolm X, he was too violent. That's why it didn't work out for him. But he died in just the same way as MLK did and died after MLK, right? Like they got to
Surprise.
MLK before they got to violent Malcolm. And I think, yeah, I think that speaks volumes. You know what I mean? Like, I think it speaks volumes to um, how meaningful MLK was. And like his meaningfulness and the depth of his work is so discarded. You know what I mean? I've heard a lot
Yeah,
of people say as I've gotten older that they think that MLK was assassinated because the government started recognizing that he was uniting not only he was uniting Black people with white people. And historically, we've seen in our country that people die when they start catalyzing poor white people and all Black people,
yeah,
right? The same thing happened to Fred Hampton, I believe, right? The government took him out. As soon as they were like, oh, poor white people are fooling with you too, we got to take you out, right? And I think, yeah, I think the way I'm saying a lot, but I feel like I'm not connecting it. I'm going to try and connect it now. I feel like the way history is constructed in a very specific way to keep the oppressed feeling oppressed, right? Like that's what I took this amazing class when I was a senior in college, a junior in college, that presented slavery as a system for Black folks to take agency over their lives and their narrative. as opposed to looking at slavery as, and slavery was a terrible thing that happened, right? It was violent. It was absolutely terrible.
Right.
But the stories that my professor gave me at my HBCU were of all these stories of slave rebellions, of the ways in which
Right.
slaves,
Right. Right.
enslaved persons took agency over their lives. And that was really important for me because there's almost this infantilizing of slaves that happens.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
You're supposed
Yes.
to almost feel
Yes.
sorry for them, like you do, the kids
Yes.
in Africa, and that,
Yes.
you know, you almost make them like aliens, like not real
Yes.
humans, right? Like Black people have been the same since the beginning of time, right? Like we have been figuring things out since the beginning of time. So to act like for the entirety of my, uh, before I went to college, that learning, to act like Black people were just these lowly, not knowing what to do people is just unrealistic. So to bring it back to MLK, that's the image that we've been given of MLK, that he was just this cool, guy that wanted Black kids and white kids to be together, and he was super sweet and we all loved him. So weird that he got killed though, right? Like that's a strategy. Just like we're saying nonviolence is a strategy,
Yes.
or just like we're saying, we mentioned nonviolence, and I think of
Yeah.
nonviolence as a strategy. The way history is presented to our children, particularly Black children, is a strategy to make them, I think, less activated, less aroused, if you will,
Yes.
right? If you
Yeah.
think, oh, the greatest liberator of all time was just sitting at a lunch counter, and keeping it cool, that's going to affect the way you are activated and radicalized as well.
Yeah. You make an excellent point. I think and I think you're right, Bethany, in excuse me, in that the the way history is presented is very strategic.
Mm-hmm.
It is strategic. For instance, um, there are 45 states with Confederate monuments. However, there were only 13 Confederate states, but there are 45 states with Confederate monuments. So what does that mean? What does that mean? I interpret that, and as I look at the events that preceded the civil, I mean that were at the end of this, that happened after the Civil War, right? When 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 the traitors who actually took up arms against the United States, 10 seconds after Robert E. Lee surrendered, and I'm exaggerating about 10 seconds, but it was very quickly, they let them put their hand on the Bible and say, "My bad." And and so all of them got their land back, right? Not only did they get their land back, but they got to control the narrative of what
Mm-hmm.
the war was actually about.
Mm-hmm.
So not only did little Black children not get a clearer picture of what the war was about, but little white children didn't either. And so this romanticized history and this Santa Clausing of our heroes, we either Santa Claus them or we eliminate them altogether, or we make them look crazy like you
Mm-hmm.
presented. It is absolutely deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
We don't, when we're in history class in high school, we do not hear about Denmark Vesey.
Mm-hmm.
We don't. Yet Denmark Vesey organized more slaves than Nat Turner did. Denmark Vesey had the potential to pull off a really huge rebellion. It is estimated that Denmark Vesey actually organized 9,000 slaves in South Carolina. That's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of slaves, right? He organized 9,000. Anyway, so but we don't hear about that. We don't hear those stories.
And that
We
was strategic too, right? So like
absolutely.
they being historians, say that there were at least 211, I believe, slave rebellions in the Americas. But mass media kept that, I'm trying to think of a better way of saying this, but kept that on the low because they didn't want that to get around to other slaves. People are empowered by shifts happen when other people see somebody make a shift, right? Like I can think of, I was one of my first friends to start going to therapy and to talk openly about going to therapy. And a lot of my friends followed suit within the last, I've been in therapy for 5 years. I would say in the last 1 to 3 years, most of my friends now go to therapy. And I think I'm using that comparison to say that when people's eyes are open to somebody that's like them can do something, they jump on it. And that was the case with slave rebellions. The media kept that. Slave masters were like, do not put this rebellion in the newspapers because these other slaves are going to get a bright idea and we don't need that.
Well, coincidentally, Denmark Vesey was actually in contact with the nation of Haiti, because Haiti actually had thrown off slavery in 1804, right? So this is about 16 years before Denmark Vesey's planned rebellion. So it was still relatively fresh. And slaves in the United States, or captives in the United States, were not supposed to know about the rebellion in Haiti because, just as you said, we don't want them to get any bright ideas. And the other point that you make, because you mentioned the term historians, and I think part of our challenge in thinking about our education and the education of our children is that historians don't play a role in what turns up in the history books. You see, in the history books that they use in our schools, in our elementary schools, our our middle schools, and our high schools, historians are not the ones who write those textbooks. Politicians write those not right, but politics and politicians have a say over what goes in the textbooks. That's why a young man, when Donald Trump was planning to do his rally in Tulsa, and it eventually got squashed because it was the day that would have been commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa riot. There was a young man on television being interviewed about that. And he said when he was in college, he was sitting in a classroom and his professor was talking about the Greenwood riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, this young man is in college. And he stood up and said, "You've got your facts wrong. I grew up in Greenwood in Tulsa, and I've never heard of that." The professor literally had to show him, here's what happened. And so now you have a young man who literally grew up in Tulsa, grew up in the Greenwood district, had no idea. And so was it an accident? Was it some accident in the education system that was not taught to them little black kids? Because he's not the only little black kid in Tulsa that grew up in that time period that didn't know about the Greenwood riot. So the teaching of history, or the approach to historic events, I should say, is not done in a way that is helpful for our children, because it's like that movie with Jack Nicholson where he said, "You can't handle the truth." So somebody has decided for us that there are certain things that we just shouldn't know because either we can't handle them or they're going to make us think differently about the nation that we live in. I propose that knowing those things make us think more accurately about where we live.
Yeah, I always feel like America, I always have weird metaphors, but I can think of somebody that I like follow on Facebook that's like super into fashion and like will post pictures of themselves next to Beyonce, calling themselves an icon. And I'm always kind of like, I don't really like your fashion sense that much. Like, you just put some shorts on top of a pair of jeans. I don't understand why you did that. Wow. Like, I'm missing something here. And that's I feel about America. Is like, yeah, you know, you're talking a lot of hot shit really confidently, but I'm not quite getting what's going
Yeah.
on here. Like, this is not my experience. Um, it's interesting as I'm thinking about the word strategy again. Like, the way history is presented throughout time is a strategy. That's basically what
Yes.
you and I were just
Yeah.
saying.
Right.
And the strategy is to uphold this idea of the American dream, but there isn't an American dream, right? There's only the American reality, and the American reality is that we live in an extremely racialized and violent society that perpetuates violence against Black and Brown bodies in every way possible, right? Like, when
Right.
I think of the American dream, is not the Mexican children that are held in those camps right now, right?
Right.
The
Right.
American dream isn't all of the Black and brown, all the Black folks that are in prison right now, but now all these white folks are making money off of cannabis for shit that got Black folks locked up in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, right?
Right.
That doesn't
Right.
sound like a dream, right?
Right.
America's
Right.
reality is kind of a nightmare, but the way history is presented to us is to uphold this fictional idea of an American dream.
Yeah. The the um the other piece to that, I mean, I fully agree with what you said. There's imagery that is just absolutely false. But it's presented to us as though it's this real thing. And the idea of this dream, it clearly also implies that there are some people who are absolutely supposed to have access to this dream,
Mm-hmm.
and then there are others who should not aspire to that at all. So so the thing that makes the the um, the the approach to history so dangerous for everybody, um, white people and people of color alike, is that because we don't know because we don't know the stories from more than one perspective, that means that we don't know what to be alert to, we don't know what to really be aware of, and we don't know what to be alarmed about when the same events present themselves in our time. You see,
Mm-hmm.
so so we don't have that thing where it says, where we could say, oh, wait a minute, this is not the first time that this has happened, because in most of these cases it's not. But
Right.
because we don't have a way to contextualize it historically, we we have to pretend that we have to figure out how to deal with this, rather than knowing how it was dealt with last time this happened, what worked and what did not. So for uh, one example of the ways that this hurts everybody, Black History Month actually is a way to promote white supremacy. We're having a
Interesting.
lot of
Say more. I like
we're
Black
having,
History Month.
yeah,
About to
so
log
do
off of this Zoom.
so do I. So do I. And one of the people who very often gets ignored is Carter Woodson, who, without him, Black History Month would just never have happened at all. But he generally gets ignored on Black History Month. But here's who we get, and this is why I say it promotes white supremacy. In first grade, in first grade, Black History Month, the teacher will say, "This is who we're going to study." We get Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. Who else?
That's like it.
That's it. So
Those are
that's
your like one person every week for the month of February.
right. So that's first grade. So then in sixth grade, Black History Month, now you actually have to write a paper on Dr. Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, or Sojourner Truth, right? So that's sixth grade. So by the time you get to 11th grade, and now it's Dr. Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, they may have added one other person, in there. What you begin to recognize before you even get to 11th grade what you begin to realize as a little African American child is this is not really that serious.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not. And in the early grades, you'll find that African American children very often get exacerbated when it's time for Black History Month. And one of the reasons why is because the school system has already demonstrated that this is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And how did they do that? They did that by making sure that you are doing the same thing in sixth grade that you were doing in first grade.
Mm-hmm.
No other subject in school will allow you to do that. People in sixth grade are not doing the same math that they were doing in first grade. People in 11th grade are not doing the same math that they were doing in sixth grade.
Mm-hmm.
Even when you look at regular so-called white history or regular history, you are not talking about the same people in 11th grade that you talked about in fourth grade. You're just not.
Mm-hmm.
Every subject in school is progressive, which is the whole point of education, that it's progressive. You learn more as you continue to grow. What I think that our children begin to learn very early is that this is what the children of color learn, and this is the unspoken communication to white kids and children of color. This is not really that important. This is something that we've decided to do to make Black people feel like some of their people had some significant contributions to history, but it's really not that much because there's only a couple of them. But we have to do this because we need to do this to make the Black people feel good.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells the Black children that it's irrelevant. It tells the white children that it's irrelevant also because it's not progressive. And so before we were doing Black history, and even while we're doing Black history, the other unspoken communication is that every significant historical achievement was a person wearing white skin. Our
Mm-hmm.
teachers don't have to say that. That's unspoken communication that you get all through school, that every significant historical thing, white people, not just white people, white men.
Mm-hmm.
So then on this 1 month, we raise up these 4 or 5 people all through all through from first grade to 12th grade. We raise up those 5 people.
We're
And
presented in this kind of superhuman way, right? Like Martin Luther King is presented as this superhuman that could tolerate all types of brutality. Y'all little
right,
Black kids should do that too when the cops pull you over. Or like Harriet Tubman miraculously, freed all these people and she couldn't even read, like
right,
they're
yeah,
presented in these uh really
yeah,
intangible ways, right? Like they were regular people like we were that were activated, but they're
that's a good point.
presented in this, which is
Yeah,
also a lens of white supremacy, right? That like Black people's humanity is never really seen as really human. We're either subhuman or superhuman, but we
yeah,
just don't get to be regular
right,
humans ever.
yeah, yeah. I like that observation. Because I think that's very true. That's why we continue to pick those 4 or 5 people,
Mm-hmm.
and just render Black History Month literally irrelevant. And now back to Dr. King's birthday celebration. What we've done with that is we've rendered it irrelevant also, in that we've turned it into this day of service. In order to celebrate Dr. King's birthday, you turn it into a day of service where, again, somebody's at Fill Abundance, or you go to a food bank somewhere and you fill
Mm-hmm.
boxes with cans of beans. So while Dr. King was concerned about poverty, he was concerned about food insecurity, um, he was not filling boxes. He was not filling boxes with cans of beans at the local food bank. Not that he wouldn't have. What would have been what I think would have been closer to his legacy would have been a march to the state capitol
Mm-hmm.
to 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 protest for higher wages
Mm-hmm.
and fair housing and 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 fair wages so that people can actually live, so that people don't have to go to the food bank. You see, I think Dr. King would have been leaning more towards that, organizing people not to build a playground in the ghetto. This is stuff that makes white people feel good.
It's
They
stuff that
turn,
makes white people feel good.
yeah,
MLK Day, not only has MLK's legacy been manipulated to make white people feel good and to be comfortable with him because their grandmammies weren't comfortable with him, let's keep it a bean, but the day celebrating him is about making white people feel good too, because community
yep,
service, I have critiques of community service and nonprofits. I feel like nonprofits exploit and perpetuate violence against Black bodies, and nonprofits wouldn't exist without oppression, right? Like if we didn't have systems of oppression that keep Black people relegated to the outskirts of society, there would be no nonprofits. So nonprofits are dependent upon Black trauma. But I oftentimes feel like white folks like to do something, again, comfortable and fluffy that makes them feel good about themselves and like they're affecting change. But like, I don't know, no shade to Mennonite Central Committee or anything, but I just filling boxes with cans and stuff doesn't always feel like the real radical shift that needs to happen, right?
right,
You can fill
right,
12 boxes with cans of canned goods and send them off to anybody, but then you don't want to talk to the Black people that go to your church, or you don't want to hear a Black person say something when you've offended them, right? It's all about their stuff, or it's all about you could have said that nicer, right? So I think that's my issue with community service is,
yeah.
you do this fluffy thing to make yourself feel better, but when it actually comes to the hard work of relating to your Black brothers and sisters, you'll leave the church before you do.
With them, everything has to be fluffy. You see, not only do I get to oppress you, I get to control the way you address me about the way I oppress you. And
Mm-hmm.
if you address me in a way that makes me uncomfortable, then there's something wrong with you, and I've decided to not listen to you. So,
Exactly.
so
Oh,
you're
because
right
you
that
said it too mean, I don't have to listen to anything that you said.
absolutely. So, and what the conversation that we were having earlier about Malcolm v. Martin, what that proves is there is no there is no acceptable way.
No.
There is no acceptable way. Um, Martin chose a path. You didn't like him.
Mm-hmm.
Malcolm chose a path that said, by any means necessary. That scared the shit out of you.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't like that. But you were scared of Martin too.
You were just as afraid of Martin.
Right. You were just as afraid of Martin. Again, his approval rating was 10%. That's pretty damn low. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for a national public figure to have an approval rating of 10%, that means that the nation didn't like you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you didn't like Martin. His approach wasn't palatable. You didn't like Malcolm. It was a totally different approach. Well, that one wasn't palatable either. So then what? What?
What's
Um,
acceptable?
what's acceptable? Because many of those ministers, when Martin wrote that letter from the Birmingham jail, much of that letter was challenging the so-called Christian ministers,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Who love
who,
to preach about Martin Luther King now.
oh yeah, oh yeah,
They love a good Martin Luther King Sunday sermon. They also like to weaponize Martin Luther King against us.
yeah,
Every time, Black people reasonably respond uproariously or even violently. And I say violence is reasonable, not to incite violence, right? I'm not Donald Trump, or not to encourage people to be violent, but you can only slap somebody so many times before you should expect a response. And I think the same thing happens with oppressed people. So every time, there's some sort of violent uprising, every pastor I know wants to quote MLK's peacemaking quote, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
yeah,
another reason
yeah,
why Martin
yeah.
Luther King was repugnant to me, was because he had been weaponized against me by so many white people that
Good
totally
point.
ignored all the other stuff that he said.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And good point. The other thing that I think is not talked about enough uh, in in uh, in remembering the legacy of Dr. King is that when he was assassinated, he was in Memphis preparing. The sanitation workers were already organized. He was planning to march with the sanitation workers.
Mm-hmm,
He was not marching to the food bank to fill boxes with food. He was marching for fair wages.
mm-hmm,
Pay these people a living wage. They don't have to go to the food bank. So
exactly.
so Dr. King's legacy was so much more about about uh, challenging the status quo,
Absolutely.
and the 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 bastardization of his legacy is that we've we've rather than turning it into something that challenges the status quo, we've turned it into an acceptance of the status quo,
Mm-hmm,
which that's what makes the celebrating of this day repugnant to me,
mm-hmm,
in that in that it it it's making us accept the status quo. Well,
mm-hmm,
there's lots of poor people who don't have enough to eat. Well, let's fill some boxes with cans.
mm-hmm,
Rather than carrying our ass to where we can actually affect some systemic change, we want to throw sandwiches at poor people.
mm-hmm.
You know,
Or paint a mural because these
oh,
these poor little Black children don't have enough beauty and art in their lives.
yep,
Well, actually fund their fucking schools so that they have some beauty and art in their lives. Like,
surprise.
there's all of this fluff that doesn't actually get at the root of the issue, just makes white folks feel like they did good one day
Right, right,
a year.
right. And Dr. King was not trying to make y'all feel good. Now, as a matter of
And
fact,
he didn't make y'all feel
not
good.
not at all. The fact that his approval rating was 10% means that he was effective in making you feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Go ask
Rather,
your grandmammy.
right? He was
Go
he
ask
was
your
a
grandmammy. She'll
yeah,
tell you.
he was effective in making you feel uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
which which
She'll probably say,
which
I didn't like that colored fellow that much.
yeah. Uh, his
Don't
his
put that
legacy
on Facebook, though.
his legacy was that, look, y'all are not supposed to feel comfortable with the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Put your paintbrush down, and put your walking shoes on. You know, put that can of beans down and get your walking shoes on.
Mm-hmm.
We got some marching to do because there's shit to protest about. And the thing that makes it most annoying about his legacy is because we've Santa Claused him, the very things that he was protesting in 1965, 66, 67, 68, we're dealing with those exact
Right now.
same things today.
Right now, because we've sanitized his image and have not
Exactly.
gotten to the real root and essence of what he was talking about.
Right.
I read his speech, Our God is Marching On, for an event through my church this morning, and I started crying. And last night I read it and I started weeping. I was able to get it together for our actual presentation today. But I started crying because it broke my heart that speech that I read could have been made over the summer, and it damn sure could have been made a week and a half ago,
Yeah.
after the Capitol was taken siege.
Right.
And I
Right.
felt there's a part in that speech where he says, how long, not long. And he lists something, how long, not long. And I'm just like, man, it's a long time and we're fighting these same fights. What would
Right.
MLK think? Would
Right.
he be frustrated? Would
Right.
he have thrown in the towel?
Well, you use an interesting word. You use the word fight, that we're fighting the same fight, and you use the word we. Therein are the two challenging words. Because when a number of years ago, I attended the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. This was in 2001. It was August of 2001. And I remember sitting in this, there was a lot of NGOs from all over the world sitting in this stadium. It was in a soccer stadium. And this was the NGO gathering before the conference, okay? So the South Africans are they're singing their redemption songs. Go Leli Africa, and the Palestinians are singing their redemption songs. And so the NGOs from all over the world, everybody's singing their redemption songs, and we're gathering and we're singing along. And I remember lamenting that, that what the hell are our redemption songs? What the fuck is my redemption song? And I'm definitely not singing, I'm not holding hands and singing We Shall Overcome. I hate that song. But I shouldn't. But the song that we did sing, which made me roll my eyes to the back of my head until I started paying more attention to the words, was the so-called Black National Anthem.
I was going to say, I love that song.
The reason that I started loving that song again was, let us march on till victory is won. That's the part that made me smile and say, oh yes, the part that's been missing for me was the fight on till victory is won. Mm-hmm. So we're not sitting still. We are marching on. We are fighting on. The struggle continues. Let's get busy. Mm-hmm. So that conference actually redeemed that song for me. Because I was tired. Go ahead.
I have fond memories of Lift Every Voice because at my HBCU, we would sing that before the national anthem. And I always felt more connected to that song and the depth of that song than I ever did the national anthem. I also think the person that wrote Lift Every Voice, are they from Philly? I think I just want to make everybody from Philly.
Well, of course they're from Philly.
He is from Philly, right?
Yeah,
okay.
I don't know, but I'm with you. He's from Philly.
You know what? If white people want to change history, I'm going to change history too.
Yeah, he's from Philly. Ooh. Listen, we sing that song every Sunday at my church.
Yeah, I love that. That's amazing.
Every Sunday at my church, we sing that song every Sunday. Yeah, and I love that. I love that about it. But yeah, that song was redeemed for me with that line, which I had forgotten how important that line was. Let us march on till victory is won. Mm-hmm. So that's our struggle. We march on till victory is won. We try to reclaim, let's reclaim the responsibility that we have to be true to the legacy of Dr. King, mm-hmm. and take the responsibility that falls upon us to make sure that the children that are in our immediate universe get that piece of education that we didn't get. And it's up to us to make sure that they get it.
Yeah. I think that's a good word to close on. It's our responsibility.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's all we have for y'all, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in with us on Martin Luther King Day. That's it.
White people, y'all march on Martin Luther King Day. Black people and other people of color, take a nap.
Take a nap.